The abandoned hospital wing in the Appalachians, patients who were never real. Virginia, 1928. Before we begin, drop your location and the current time in the comments. I go through every single one. And if this channel is new to you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. These stories find the people ready for them. Now, let's return to Virginia, 1928. In southwestern Virginia, that truth wasn't poetry. It was something felt in the bones, passed through coal miners and hollow-eyed widows who understood, long before their kids could talk, that the Appalachian Mountains hold secrets like old men hold grudges, quietly, forever, with no plan of letting go. October 1987. A geological survey team from the University of Virginia drove a mud-caked pickup down a logging road so narrow that pine branches scraped both sides of the truck at once, leaving long green scratches in the white paint like reluctant fingers. They were following a 1949 survey map that showed nothing unusual about the land ahead, just elevation lines, just terrain, just the indifferent shape of a mountain that had stood for 300 million years. Their target was a ridge above the Clinch River, 11 miles southwest of Castlewood in Russell County. They were searching for signs of a geological fault line, a routine survey, the kind nobody outside the department ever reads about. But what Dr. Margaret Holloway saw when the truck cleared the last bend wasn't a fault line. It was a building. She stepped out slowly, one boot sinking into soft, wet earth. The structure stood 60 yards ahead, half swallowed by forest. Decades of Virginia winters had cracked its mortar, pried apart its foundation, and sent kudzu climbing up its outer walls like a slow green tide. Still, the building stood, 3 stories of dark fieldstone, its windows long empty of glass, its slate roof partly collapsed on the east wing but intact over the center. A rusted iron door hung open on the ground floor, swaying almost imperceptibly in the cold October wind. It looked like it had been waiting. Dr. Holloway turned to her research assistant, Thomas Beckett, 26 years old, 4th generation Russell County. She expected surprise. Instead, Thomas had gone pale in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. He stared at the building with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not exactly fear. The particular stillness of a man who has just heard a sound from a room that should be empty. "Tom," she said, "do you recognize this place?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual. "My grandmother used to tell us, never go past the 3rd ridge after dark. Never go near the Clinch in winter. And never, under any circumstances, go looking for the building on the hill." He paused. "I always thought she was just trying to keep us from getting lost in the woods." To understand what Holloway's team found inside that building, you first have to understand the world that built it. The year was 1928. On the surface, America was in its most prosperous decade. Jazz-filled parlors. The stock market climbed toward heights economists called perfectly sustainable. The future, as far as newspapers were concerned, was bright and expanding. But those newspapers weren't written in Russell County, Virginia. In the coal hollows of southwestern Virginia, the 1920s looked nothing like the magazine photos. Towns like Dante, Clinchco, and Haysai were company towns in the most suffocating sense. The coal companies owned the houses, the stores, even the currency. They printed their own scrip, redeemable only at company stores, so a man could work his whole life underground and die without ever holding a real dollar. Miners worked 12, sometimes 14 hours a day in shafts so tight they crawled on their knees to reach the coal face. They breathed black dust every hour of every working day. And they called the cough that eventually killed them miners' asthma, because naming something made it feel survivable. Children grew up in 2-room clapboard houses without plumbing or heat. Infant mortality in Russell County in 1928 ran nearly 4 times the national average. Tuberculosis moved through the hollow communities with casual efficiency. Pellagra, rickets, typhoid, diseases largely wiped out in American cities, were still regular visitors in the mountain hollows. The state government in Richmond knew about these conditions the way large institutions know about inconvenient facts, abstractly, distantly, and with a strong preference for doing nothing expensive. Then Dr. Edmund Harlow arrived. Dr. Edmund Harlow was 44 in 1928. Tall, thin, steel-rimmed spectacles. A deliberate, unhurried manner that strangers mistook for kindness. Johns Hopkins, class of 1908. 3 years of research in Germany, a fact he mentioned often. By 1928, he was one of Virginia's most respected authorities on infectious pulmonary disease. He was also a committed eugenicist. The word hadn't yet taken on its post-1945 weight. In 1928, eugenics was respectable, endorsed by universities, funded by major foundations, promoted by prominent figures across the political spectrum. The premise was brutally simple: society improves by encouraging reproduction among the genetically superior and preventing existence among the inferior. The poor, the disabled, the mentally ill, these were problems to be solved. Virginia had been an early enthusiast. The Virginia Eugenical Sterilization Act passed in 1924. By 1928, the state's institutions for the mentally ill were running sterilization programs. The Supreme Court had just upheld in Buck v. Bell, the decision where Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes declared, without apparent discomfort, that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Harlow kept a copy of that decision in his desk. In the summer of 1928, he brought the Virginia State Board of Health a proposal. The tuberculosis epidemic in the Appalachian coalfields, he argued, represented both a public health crisis and a unique research opportunity. The isolated populations of southwestern Virginia, poor, uneducated, with no access to legal resources, were, in his clinical language, an ideal study cohort. What he was proposing, carefully worded to avoid stating it directly, was a facility where patients from the hollow communities could be admitted, studied, and subjected to experimental treatments without informed consent, institutional oversight, or public scrutiny. A facility that would exist, for all practical purposes, outside the medical system entirely. The Board of Health approved the proposal in September 1928. Funding was routed through 3 separate accounts to hide its origin. Construction began in October using workers brought in from Kentucky with no local ties, paid in untraceable cash. By December, the building on the ridge above the Clinch River was complete. It had no official name. It appeared on no state registry, no hospital license, no medical accreditation, no administrative code. The land was registered to a timber company that had never conducted any operations in Russell County. For all official purposes, the building did not exist. And the patients who were brought there, quietly, in unmarked vehicles, collected from hollows and mining camps under the pretense of a free medical evaluation, officially did not exist either. Thomas Becket followed Dr. Holloway through the iron door. The interior smell hit immediately: cold stone, wet rot, and something older underneath. Dense and still, like a sealed room. Like something that hadn't moved in 60 years and hadn't wanted to. A long corridor ran straight ahead. Doors on both sides, heavy wooden doors, most hanging open, hinges rusted the color of dried blood. The floor was buried under fallen plaster, dead leaves, and the remains of furniture reduced to gray splinters. At the far end, a staircase climbed into darkness. The first room on the left, 12 feet by 10, a single iron bed frame bolted to the floor, a small barred window. The plaster walls had buckled, but enough remained to show they had once been white. In the beam of her flashlight, Dr. Holloway saw scratches, not random damage, but letters, words, carved into the plaster with deliberate care at the height of a seated person, as if whoever made them had been sitting on the floor, back against the wall, reaching up as far as they could. William Cates, Dante, Virginia, brought here November 1928. I am not sick. I am not sick. Please. She stood for a long moment. Beside her, Thomas Becket exhaled slowly. She moved to the next room. Ruth Combs, Hasey, Virginia. My children don't know where I am. The next, John Fletcher, age 14, Clinchco. They said it was a checkup. And the next, room after room, corridor after corridor, each holding a name and a town and a date and a few desperate words pressed into plaster by someone who had understood, with terrible clarity, that the only protest available to them was to insist, in whatever material they had, that they had been here, that they had existed, that someone, someday, should know it. By the time they reached the staircase, Dr. Holloway had counted 47 names. She had not yet gone upstairs. She had not yet found the room on the third floor where the tin box was hidden in the false wall, the box that would consume the next 2 years of her life before disappearing from university records under circumstances never satisfactorily explained. She had not yet learned that the building had operated not for months but for nearly 4 years. She had not yet begun to understand the full scale of what had happened here. But standing at the bottom of that dark staircase, with 47 names echoing in her memory and the cold mountain wind moving through the empty window frames above her, she understood enough. She understood that these walls had held human beings brought against their will, identified by no document, protected by no law, mourned by no institution. She understood that somewhere in the hollows below this mountain, there were families who had spent 60 years not knowing. And she understood, with the particular quiet certainty of a scientist who has just found something the world has decided it doesn't want found, that what she did next would matter. Not for her career. Not for the university. But for a 14-year-old boy from Clinch named John Fletcher, who had come in for a checkup and had scratched his name into a stone wall with his fingernail so that someone, someday, would know he had been there. Outside, the wind moved through the pines of the Appalachian Ridge. The Clinch River ran cold and dark far below. The mountains held their silence absolutely, without apology, without any indication they intended to stop. But the names were still there. 47 of them. Waiting. There is a particular kind of evil that wears good manners. It arrives on time. It shakes hands firmly. It uses the clean, precise language of science and civic duty to describe things that, stripped of their vocabulary, would make an ordinary person sick. It files its paperwork correctly, attends the right dinners, donates to the right causes. It builds institutions and signs documents and retires with honors. And the damage it causes is often not discovered until long after the responsible men have been buried in churchyards with granite headstones that say nothing about what they actually did. Dr. Edmund Harlow was, by every external measure, an exemplary man. That's what made him so hard to investigate. When Dr. Holloway returned to Charlottesville in October 1987, she brought 3 things: a notebook of transcribed names, 17 rolls of photographic film, and a professional unease she couldn't fully articulate. She reported the discovery to her department chair, Dr. Frederick Anston, expecting at least a conversation about historical preservation. What she received was a response so carefully lukewarm it took her weeks to recognize it for what it was. Anston listened with his hands folded on his desk. He agreed the discovery was interesting. He suggested a preliminary report. He mentioned once, briefly, that she should be careful about drawing conclusions without more evidence. Then he changed the subject. She returned to the building twice more that autumn, each time with Thomas Beckett, and on the second trip with a fourth-year history Ph.D. student named Carol Ann Marsh, who had grown up in Scott County and who, unlike Holloway, understood immediately and instinctively what she was looking at. "These are Coal Hollow people," Carol Ann said, standing in the first-floor corridor with her flashlight and recorder. "Cates, Combs, Fletcher, these are old Appalachian families. Nobody from the Hollows voluntarily got in a car and went to a hospital in 1928. They didn't have cars." She ran her fingers along the edge of a name carved above a doorframe. "Somebody brought them here. Somebody came to their houses and told them something." It was Carol Ann who suggested searching the Virginia State Board of Health archives. And it was Carol Ann who found, buried in an uncatalogued collection of 1928 administrative correspondence, a 3-page letter dated August 14 of that year, addressed to the board's director, signed by one Dr. E.R. Harlow of Richmond. The letter proposed a field research installation in the southwestern Virginia coal fields. It cited tuberculosis mortality rates accurately. It cited the absence of medical infrastructure accurately. And then, in the final paragraph of the second page, it contained a sentence that Carol and read aloud to the team in a voice that was very quiet and very steady. The subjects of this study, drawn from populations with limited civic visibility and no meaningful access to legal recourse, represent an exceptional opportunity to conduct longitudinal research under conditions of controlled isolation that would be impossible to replicate in any conventional institutional setting. She stopped reading. Limited civic visibility. Thomas Becket repeated from the corner of the archive room. Nobody said anything else for a long moment. Edmund Robert Harlow had been born in 1884 in Roanoke, the second son of a railroad attorney who had done very well in the expansion years of the late 19th century. He grew up in a three-story Victorian on Franklin Road, a world of genuine cultural aspiration and a rigid, unexamined hierarchy of human worth that presented itself as natural law. He was serious, intellectually gifted, and impatient with social performance. He attended the University of Virginia for his undergraduate degree, then Johns Hopkins for medical school, graduating in 1908 with a specialization in pulmonary disease. Tuberculosis was the great epidemic of the early 20th century, and positioning himself as an expert would earn both prestige and grant funding. He understood this clearly and had no difficulty with the calculation. In 1909, he went to Germany. This was standard for American physicians of his generation. Germany was the world capital of medical research, and a period of study there was considered essential for serious academic doctors. Harlow spent 3 years at the University of Berlin, publishing in German-language journals on pulmonary bacteriology, and absorbing, alongside his medical education, a framework of thought about human populations that was, in Germany between 1909 and 1912, both academically mainstream and profoundly dangerous. He came home fluent in German and absolutely convinced that sorting human beings by hereditary value was not merely acceptable but a moral imperative, a civilizational duty. He had never been asked to examine the foundations of that conviction, and it did not occur to him to do so. The subsequent 16 years built a career of surface legitimacy, faculty at the Medical College of Virginia, regular publications on tuberculosis treatment, advisory member of the Virginia Board of Health since 1919, board member of the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded in Lynchburg, the institution that had sterilized Carrie Buck in Buck vs. Bell. None of it was hidden. None of it needed to be. In 1928 in Virginia, these were credentials. But the building above the Clinch River was something else. Because what Harlow proposed in his August letter was not a sterilization program, not an epidemiological survey, not, in any sense any ethical body would recognize, a research program at all. It was a human experimentation facility. And buried in the careful clinical language of his proposal, this was legible enough to anyone paying attention. Carol and Marsh spent 3 weeks in the Board of Health archives. She was methodical, patient, and possessed of a researcher's instinct for following the shape of absences, the ability to notice what a document isn't saying. She found the original approval letter signed by Board Director Gerald Pruitt in September 1928. She found 3 funding authorizations routed through different intermediary accounts, a charitable foundation, a timber company, a Richmond bank, endowment totaling just over $42,000 across 4 years. In 1928 dollars, enough to build a 3-story stone building on a remote ridge and keep it running for years. She found a brief reference in a 1931 internal memo to the Clinch River facility, the only document she encountered that named the building at all, in the context of disposing of research materials. The memo didn't specify what those materials were. It didn't need to. And in a collection of personal correspondence misfiled under an incorrect administrative code, surviving the purge that had erased most other references precisely because it had been shelved in the wrong location, she found 4 letters between Harlow and 3 other men. The first was Dr. Clarence Wolfe, Chief Medical Officer of the Pocahontas Coal Company in Tazewell County. His letters to Harlow discussed the referral of suitable cases from mine workers to the Clinch River facility. The word referral appeared consistently in quotation marks, as if even Wolfe felt the need to signal in private correspondence that the word was being used in something other than its normal sense. The second was Thomas Aldrich, a member of the Virginia House of Delegates from Russell County who also sat on the boards of two coal companies. His letters were shorter and more cautious, a politician who understood that correspondence could be subpoenaed, but their content was plain. He was providing Harlow with the county's public health nurse network to identify eligible subjects in the hollow communities and a quiet assurance that the county sheriff's office would not be overly attentive to activities in the Ridge area. The third was the most surprising. Dr. Arthur Pemberton Voss, not an obscure figure. A professor of medicine at Johns Hopkins, director of a research foundation funded by one of America's major industrial families, one of the most respected names in American public health. He had testified before Congress. His work was cited in national policy discussions. He was also, as his letters to Harlow made clear, the intellectual architect of the Clinch River facility. Voss had outlined the research protocols. Voss had specified the patient selection criteria. Voss had designed what he called in his letters, with the serene confidence of a man who had never questioned himself, the experimental sequence. And it was Voss who had written, in a letter dated November 3, 1928, 6 weeks after the facility opened, the sentence Carol and would later describe as the most chilling thing she had ever read in an archive. The material is excellent. Proceed as discussed. In February 1988, Holloway presented the findings to the university's history department. Well attended, good questions, apparent scholarly interest. Afterward, Dr. Anston asked to speak with her privately. He expressed admiration for the rigor of the research. He noted the findings were historically significant. And then, in the careful, unhurried tone of a man delivering a message he had been asked to deliver, he told her that the university's legal counsel had advised that publishing findings naming specific individuals, some of whose families were still professionally active in Virginia, would expose the institution to significant legal and reputational risk. He recommended she narrow the scope, focus on the geological aspects of the site, perhaps write something about rural medical architecture, something that would acknowledge the historical record without, and this was the precise word he used and she never forgot, unnecessarily disturbing current institutional relationships. She walked out of his office and stood in the November cold for several minutes. Then she went to her office and called Carol and Marsh. "They're going to try to bury it," she said. "I know," Carolyn said. She had been expecting the call. "What do you want to do?" Dr. Holloway thought about a 14-year-old boy from Clinchco named John Fletcher. "I want to go back to the building," she said. "I want to photograph every name on every wall, and I want to find out what's on the third floor." Brief silence. "When do we go?" Carolyn asked. "This weekend. Before anyone decides to make the building disappear, too." They drove back to Russell County on a Friday afternoon in late November. Thomas Beckett drove. He had said very little about the archival findings but had arrived at Holloway's office at 7 a.m. with 2 thermoses of coffee and a look of quiet, fixed determination that needed no explanation. The building was unchanged. The iron door still hung on its single hinge. The forest was completely still, the kind of stillness that feels less like peace than like held breath. They went directly to the third floor. The eastern wing had partially collapsed, 2 rooms inaccessible, floors rotted through, but the western wing was largely intact. 3 rooms, doors still on their hinges. The first western room appeared to have served as an office. Iron shelf brackets remained along one wall. The rusted skeleton of a metal desk sat in the corner. Thomas was the one who found it, running his flashlight across the north wall, stopping at a seam, not a crack, not a structural fissure, a deliberate rectangle cut into the stone and plaster, roughly 2 feet wide, 3 feet tall, patched with a slightly different plaster mixture, a shade lighter in color. Someone had sealed this opening carefully around the time the building was abandoned and had done it well enough that it had survived 60 years of mountain weather. It took 40 minutes with a geological pick, a penknife, and the flat end of a tent stake to work the patching loose. Behind it, a cavity in the wall 18 inches deep. Inside the cavity, a tin box, shoebox-sized, sealed with a rusted hasp, wrapped in deteriorating oilcloth that had done its job. Dr. Holloway lifted it out with both hands. Heavier than expected. She knelt on the cleanest section of floor, Thomas and Carol and on either side, all three using flashlights. The afternoon light through the barred window was fading fast. She opened the hasp, it broke away entirely, corroded through. She unfolded the oilcloth. 7 matching notebooks, their covers marked with dates in neat handwriting. The dates ran from November 1928 to January 1932. She opened the first page carefully. The paper was brittle but readable. At the top, in the same neat handwriting, 5 words, Harlow Clinch River Study Protocols. Below them, a list of names. Each followed by a date, an age, a place of origin, and a series of abbreviations that Carol identified with a sharp intake of breath as procedure codes. The list ran for 11 pages. There were 231 names. Outside, the Appalachian night came down over the ridge, the absolute darkness of a place without streetlights, without the orange glow of distant cities. The Clinch River ran somewhere below, invisible in the dark. 3 researchers sat on the floor of a third-floor room and read the names of 231 people who had officially never existed. They read for a very long time. And when they finally stopped, the silence around them was the kind that fills a space left by human voices that have been gone for 60 years and had never, until that night, been answered. The notebook smelled of old paper and cold stone and something faintly metallic that none of the 3 researchers wanted to speculate about too precisely. Dr. Holloway read through the first notebook by flashlight in the truck, engine running for heat. Carolyn Marsh sat beside her and took careful, methodical notes, translating the procedure codes she recognized and marking the ones she didn't, building a key as she went. Thomas Beckett stared at the dark tree line and said nothing, which was its own form of attention. What they were reading was, on its surface, the clinical record of a medical research program, formal, technical, precise. The language of science, of careful observation and measured documentation. Date, subject designation, age, procedure, observation, result. The handwriting neat and consistent throughout, the handwriting of a trained professional who had been taught that legible records were a mark of scientific rigor and who had applied that lesson faithfully to work that had no business being documented at all. But beneath the clinical language, the notebooks told a story that had nothing to do with medicine. 34 patients had been admitted between November and December of 1928 alone. Ages ranged from 11 to 63, the majority between 25 and 45, working-age adults, mostly men, from the coal communities of Russell, Tazewell, and Dickinson counties. 6 women. 3 children. One entry read simply, Subject 22, male, age 11. Dante, Virginia orphan, no family contacts on record. The admissions procedure was consistent across all cases. Subjects had been identified through the county public health nurse network on the basis of presenting symptoms consistent with pulmonary disease or constitutional weakness, a catch-all term in the eugenics literature for anyone deemed physically or mentally substandard by whatever criteria the examiner chose that day. They were transported in coal company vehicles, accompanied by a company health representative who told them uniformly that they were being taken to a specialist facility for free evaluation and treatment, provided through the generosity of the company and the state's public health service. None had been told the facility's location. None had been told how long they would stay. None had signed any document. None had been given the opportunity to contact their families. They had simply been collected from the places they lived and brought to the building on the ridge. Once admitted, each subject was assigned a number, running sequentially from Subject 1 through Subject 231 by the final notebook, placed in one of the single rooms, provided with basic food and bedding, examined daily, and then, depending on their classification within the study's protocol, assigned to one of 3 experimental groups. Group A was designated observational. These were the control cases, individuals admitted not for active experimental procedures but to provide baseline data. They received no treatment, no intervention. They were simply watched daily as their conditions evolved in the isolation of a stone room on a mountain ridge, with no contact with family and no knowledge of why they were there or when, or if, they would leave. For many of them, pre-existing conditions, tuberculosis, pneumonia, pellagra, progressed untreated through the months of their confinement. The records documented this progression with clinical precision. Declining weight, increasing respiratory distress, reduced ambulation. The notebooks did not use the word suffering. They did not use the word fear. They did not use the word pain. These were not, by the definitions in use in that room, scientifically relevant categories. Group B was designated therapeutic trial. These subjects received experimental treatments, procedures that Harlow and Voss had designed to test hypotheses about tuberculosis that were, in several cases, not far removed from what mainstream medicine was exploring at the time. Pneumothorax procedures, high-dose mineral therapy, extended forced rest protocols. The difference was consent. Group B subjects did not know they were receiving experimental treatments. They did not know the procedures had not been tested in any controlled clinical setting. They did not know the men treating them were bound by no institutional ethics review, no hospital protocol, no professional obligation beyond the research agenda designed in offices in Richmond and Baltimore. Several of the Group B procedures were, by any medical standard of any era, clearly harmful. High-dose mineral injections, far exceeding anything legitimate medicine recommended, were administered to 11 subjects. The records documented the results with the same neutrality applied to everything else. Nausea, hemorrhaging, acute renal symptoms. In 3 cases, a small notation appeared beside the entry. An asterisk followed by the abbreviation DC. Carolyn translated it flatly. Discontinued. The subject died before the procedure was complete. But it was Group C that made Carolyn Marsh close the notebook, set it carefully on her knee, and sit in complete silence for 60 seconds before she could speak. Group C was designated constitutional study. These subjects had been selected not on the basis of their medical conditions but on their social and familial profiles. They were, in the eugenics framework structuring the entire project, negative hereditary cases, individuals identified through the Public Health Nurse Network and coal company employment files as belonging to families with histories of poverty, mental illness, physical disability, or what the eugenics literature called social inadequacy. Meaning, broadly, anyone who had ever been poor, unemployed, in trouble with the law, or deemed difficult to manage by a school or public institution. The procedures assigned to Group C subjects were not tuberculosis treatments. They were not treatments of any kind. They were what Harlow's protocols described as constitutional modification procedures. Carolyn, without looking up from the notebook, translated this as well. 2 words, quietly, as if volume made a difference. Forced sterilization. Performed surgically without anesthesia in the early cases, with inadequate anesthesia in the later ones, documented in the notebooks with the same clinical neutrality as everything else. Date, subject designation, procedure, result, recovery status. The same neat handwriting, the same measured sentences. There were 47 subjects in Group C, 47. The same number as the names scratched on the first floor walls. Carolyn stared at that number for a long moment. They put them on the ground floor, she said quietly. The Group C subjects. Because they knew something was wrong. They knew what was happening to them wasn't medicine. Thomas Beckett from the front seat, his voice completely controlled, so they scratched their names. It was the only thing they could do. Nobody argued. The evidence was everywhere in the clinical language. Small, heartbreaking details embedded in Harlow's sterile prose like shards of glass. Subject 67, female, age 31, demonstrated marked agitation prior to procedure and required physical restraint. Subject 89, male, age 19, refused food for 4 days following procedure. Recovered appetite by day 6. Subject 44, female, age 24, requested repeatedly to be permitted to send correspondence to family. Request denied in accordance with study protocol. Requested repeatedly. Request denied in accordance with study protocol. A 24-year-old woman in a stone room on a mountain, asking over and over again to write to her family. Being told no. Because it would have compromised the study. The connection to broader American eugenics programs was not subtle. Harlow made no attempt to conceal the intellectual lineage of his work. The notebooks referenced directly, and by name, the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory in New York, the hub of American eugenics research funded by the Carnegie Institution and the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Virginia State Colony in Lynchburg. They cited Buck versus Bell by name, approvingly, as establishing the legal and philosophical framework within which the Clinch River study operated. Harlow clearly believed he was doing important work. The tone throughout, clinical, precise, occasionally touched with something that read uncomfortably like satisfaction when a procedure produced expected results, was the tone of a man with no internal audience questioning him. No second voice. No doubt. He was a scientist conducting a study. The subjects were not patients to be treated. They were material to be examined, data to be generated, a problem to be processed. This was not unusual. This was not aberrant. This was, in the scientific culture of 1928, an entirely mainstream set of assumptions applied with unusual freedom from institutional constraint, which was, in some ways, the most disturbing thing about the notebooks. Not that Harlow was a monster, though what he did was monstrous. But that he was, by the standards of his time and profession, something much harder to condemn, a perfectly ordinary man doing what perfectly ordinary men in his position believed was right. It was in the fourth notebook, the autumn of 1930, that the records became something other than a clinical log. The shift was subtle at first. The handwriting of the procedure entries remained consistent. But beginning in October of that year, small notations began appearing in the margins, brief, irregular, written in slightly different ink, as if added after the fact. They were not in Harlow's handwriting. Carol studied them for several minutes before arriving at the only possible conclusion. Someone, a subject, or multiple subjects, had at some point obtained access to the notebooks and written back in the margins of Harlow's clinical records. Not stolen them, the notebooks had clearly remained in the building, ending up behind the sealed wall where Holloway's team had found them. But at some point in the later years of the facility's operation, someone had been in that room, and they had written back. The first notation, beside a procedure entry for October 14, 1930, this was done to me. My name is Eliza Rowe. I am from Haysai. I have 2 daughters. Their names are May and Clara. If you find this, please tell them I was here. The second, beside an entry for November 2, my name is Samuel Pruitt, age 31. They said I was sick. I was not sick. I walked in here. I can't walk right now. The third, in a different hand, the letters formed with evident effort, there are 14 of us still here. We do not know what month it is. We have been told nothing. We ask to go home. They say soon. It has been a long time. 31 marginal notations in total, spread across the 4th and 5th notebooks. The handwriting in the final ones barely legible, letters formed with enormous physical effort, the pen pressure uneven, the lines wandering. The last notation, at the bottom of a December 1931 procedure entry, was 3 words, "Please remember us." Dr. Holloway sat with the 5th notebook in her lap for a long time after Carol read that aloud. Outside, the mountain night was absolute. The heater blew warm air across the front seats, but nobody felt warm. How many? Holloway said. It wasn't quite a question. 231 total documented subjects, Carol said. 47 Group C, clearly designated. Some later entries are incomplete. The system changes in the 6th notebook. We know the minimum. We don't know the ceiling. Thomas Beckett, from the front seat, said something that neither woman answered. Not because they disagreed, but because there was nothing to say in response that would have made it better. My grandmother knew, he said, simply, without drama, the way people from Appalachian hollows say the hardest things flatly, as a statement of fact that carries its own weight and requires no elaboration. She knew, and she couldn't tell anyone. Who was she going to tell? The county sheriff was part of it. The coal company was sending people here. The state built it. He looked at the dark tree line. So she told us not to go past the third ridge. She kept us away the only way she knew how. He put the truck in gear. Let's go home. We have what we need. Back in Charlottesville, Holloway spent 6 weeks cross-referencing the notebook names against every accessible public record she could find. Census rolls, employment records, church registers, county birth and death records. Of the 231 subjects documented in Harlow's notebooks, she identified 114 with high confidence. Of those 114, 67 had no death record prior to their admission date, meaning they had been living, documented individuals when they entered the facility. After their admission dates, for 67 of them, the public record simply stopped. No death certificates. No subsequent census entries. No employment records. No church records. Nothing. They had walked into the building above the Clinch River, and as far as any official document was concerned, they had ceased to exist. Which was, of course, exactly as planned. The facility had been designed so that if anyone looked for these people, they would find nothing. The patients had never been documented as patients. The building had never been documented as a building. And the men who built and operated it had ensured the only record of what happened there was sealed in a tin box behind a false wall on a mountain ridge that belonged to no institution. What they had not anticipated, or had not bothered to consider, because the people they were dealing with had limited civic visibility, and their descendants would never have the access to investigate, was that someone would eventually open the wall. And that the first thing they would find was 231 names. Recorded by the men who had put them there, in the cold clinical language of a science convinced it was doing the world a favor. And recorded again in the margins, in the cramped and effortful handwriting of the people who had been put there, in the only language left to them, the only protest available. My name is Eliza Rowe. I am from Haysai. I have 2 daughters. Please remember us. Below the ridge, the Clinch River ran cold through the Appalachian dark. In Haysai, in Dante, in Clinchco, families carried their gaps, the relatives who had simply not come home, the explanations that never arrived, the absences with no name. In Charlottesville, a geologist sat at a desk with 7 notebooks and 67 names that ended in silence. The mountain had kept its secret for 60 years. The question now was what the living would do with it. There is a difference between a secret and a silence. A secret is something one person knows and chooses not to tell. It is, at its core, a personal act, an individual decision made by a single will operating in the dark. Secrets can be exposed. Secrets can be confessed. Secrets end eventually because they depend on the continued discretion of a finite number of human beings, and human beings are unreliable keepers. A silence is something else entirely. A silence is institutional. It is not the decision of one person but the shared, unspoken consensus of many. The collective agreement of an entire system to orient itself away from a particular fact, to develop over time a kind of organized blindness so deeply embedded in the procedures and culture and incentives of the institution that it no longer requires active maintenance. The silence perpetuates itself naturally, the way a river perpetuates its course, not through any single act of will but through the accumulated weight of everything that has flowed before. What Dr. Margaret Holloway encountered in the spring and summer of 1988 was not a conspiracy in the dramatic, coordinated sense of the word. There was no single meeting, no single phone call, no single powerful man pulling every string. What she encountered was something more mundane and, in its way, more frightening, an institution that had decided collectively, and without anyone needing to say so directly, that certain things were better left undisturbed. And an institution with that kind of silence at its disposal is extraordinarily difficult to fight. The journalist's name was Robert Demarest. 41 years old, 20 years at the Roanoke Times, the past several of them spent writing about the history of Virginia's eugenics program, a subject that had become, in the mid-1980s, the focus of historians and journalists who had recognized that the full scale of what the state had done between 1924 and the mid-1970s had never been publicly reckoned with. He was, by every account, a serious and careful reporter, not given to sensationalism. He checked sources meticulously. He had a reputation for patience, for the willingness to sit with a story for as long as it required, accumulating documentation with the same methodical discipline Carroll and Marsh applied to archives before writing a single word for publication. When Dr. Holloway called him in March of 1988 and told him what her team had found in Russell County, he listened for the better part of an hour without interrupting. When she finished, he asked 12 questions. Precise, specific questions, the questions of a man who already understood the landscape and needed to know exactly which new terrain was being added to his map. At the end of the conversation, he said, "I need to see the notebooks." She drove to Roanoke the following Saturday and spent 4 hours in his office while he examined the photocopies. He read slowly, stopping to make notes, occasionally asking for clarification. When he finished, he set the last page down on his desk and sat quietly. "The names," he said. "Voss, Wolf, Aldrich. Voss is dead, died in 1962, but Wolf's son is currently the chief medical officer at Curlian Roanoke Memorial Hospital. And Aldrich, Thomas Aldrich's grandson, served in the Virginia House of Delegates until 1984. Dr. Holloway had not known this. She was a geologist. "Does that matter?" she asked. Demarest looked at her with the expression of a man who had spent 20 years watching how institutional power actually operates in a medium-sized American state. "It means," he said carefully, "that I need to be very thorough before I publish anything. And that what we have needs to be bulletproof." He began making calls the following Monday. Within 10 days, 2 things happened. First, a pair of men appeared at Demarest's office at the Roanoke Times. They identified themselves as representatives of the Virginia Attorney General's office and asked, in the politely implacable tone of people accustomed to being obeyed, to review the materials he was working with in connection with a matter under administrative review. They did not specify which matter. They produced no documentation of any administrative review. They did not technically demand anything. They simply sat across his desk and asked, with the particular quality of stillness that suggests the request is not really optional. He declined, equally politely. They left. Second, a formal letter arrived at Dr. Holloway's office requesting she surrender the recovered materials to university administrative custody pending review. She had been expecting it. She had already made her copies. She surrendered what she had agreed to surrender and kept what she had decided to keep. But the message had been sent and received. Carroll and Marsh received her message differently. In April of 1988, she was notified that her research funding for the following academic year had been discontinued. The notification cited a routine funding reallocation, referenced a policy document she had never previously encountered, and was signed by an administrative officer 3 levels above her department chair. She appealed. The appeal was denied without substantive explanation. 1 week later, her university library access card stopped working. She was told it was a technical error. The error was never corrected. 2 weeks after that, she arrived at the history department's graduate research room to find that the filing cabinet she had been using to store her Russell County notes she had intentionally kept on university property, believing incorrectly that this made them safer, had been emptied. The department administrator expressed appropriate concern and initiated what was described as an internal inquiry. The inquiry produced no findings. The notes were never returned. Carroll and Marsh left the University of Virginia in May of 1988. She did not finish her dissertation. She moved back to Scott County, took a job teaching high school history, and did not speak publicly about the Russell County research for 17 years. When she finally did speak, in a 2005 interview with a researcher from Appalachian State University, she described those months with a precision and composure that made the account more devastating than drama ever could have. I was 26 years old, she said. I thought that finding the truth was the hard part. I didn't understand yet that finding the truth is sometimes the easy part. The hard part is what happens when the truth finds the people who benefit from it staying buried. She paused. Nobody threatened me. Nobody said stop, or else. Nobody needed to. They just made it impossible for me to continue. My funding was gone. My access was gone. My notes were gone. I had a photocopied set of documents and no institutional standing to do anything with them. I was 26 years old with student loan debt and no income. Another pause. So I went home. Robert Demarest did not go home. He was 41 and tenured, and the Roanoke Times was his institution, not the University of Virginia's. The visit from the Attorney General's representatives had, if anything, sharpened his interest. In 20 years of covering Virginia politics, he had learned that the intensity of an institution's effort to suppress a story is directly proportional to the story's importance. The speed with which official representatives had appeared at his office suggested that whatever the notebooks contained, someone considered it worth considerable inconvenience to contain. He spent the next 3 months working the story from multiple directions simultaneously, cross-referencing the notebook records against surviving public archives, interviewing elderly residents of Russell and Dickinson counties who had been alive in 1928, tracing the institutional careers of the men named in the correspondence files. What he assembled was a picture that stretched well beyond Dr. Edmund Harlow and the building above the Clinch River. The Clinch River facility was not an isolated aberration, a single rogue physician in a remote location. It was, as the correspondence made clear, a node in a network of informal research projects operating under the umbrella of Virginia's eugenics program, using the state's institutional infrastructure, public health nurses, coal company medical systems, county administrative machinery, to access populations with no realistic means of legal recourse. The Clinch River facility was the one built with stone walls. The one that had lasted long enough and been sealed carefully enough that its records survived. But it was not the only one. This was the finding Demarest described in a July 1988 phone call to Holloway as, the part that keeps me up at night. Because the building in Russell County, that's documented. We have the notebooks. We have the names. We can prove what happened there. But the correspondence between Harlow and Voss references 2 other sites. One in Dickinson County, one in Buchanan County. And those sites, I can't find them. Not in the records, not in the field. Which means either the records were more completely destroyed, Holloway said, or the sites themselves were more completely dismantled. Or both. Or both, he agreed. He was planning to publish in October. He did not publish in October. On the 14th of September, 1988, the building above the Clinch River caught fire. A deer hunter spotted the smoke from the logging road below at approximately 6 o'clock in the morning. The fire was already well established in the eastern wing. The Russell County Fire Department dispatched a truck that arrived 40 minutes later. By that time, the eastern wing had collapsed entirely and the fire had reached the central staircase. The fire was contained, the stone construction and the wet autumn conditions prevented it spreading to the surrounding forest. But the interior was destroyed completely. The first and second floors were gutted. The third floor collapsed into the second during suppression. The stone walls remained standing, empty and blackened, open to the autumn sky. The Russell County Fire Marshal investigated and issued a report 3 weeks later. The conclusion, in its entirety, cause of fire undetermined. No evidence of suspicious origin. Dr. Holloway read the report once, set it down, and did not pick it up again. The photographs and photocopied notebooks were in her car, in a locked case, as they had been every day since May. The names on the walls were gone. The marginal notations were gone. The only physical evidence that another human being would immediately recognize as human, the scratched names, the desperate words pressed into plaster by fingernails, the handwriting of Eliza Rowe asking someone to tell her daughters where she had been erased by heat and water, destroyed beyond any forensic recovery. The building had been cleaned. Demarest published in November of 1988. The story ran as a four-part series on consecutive Sundays under the headline, The Patients Who Never Existed, a hidden chapter of Virginia's eugenics history. It included pre-fire photographs of the building interior, reproductions of the Board of Health correspondence, and extensive excerpts from the photocopied notebooks, including the subject's marginal notations reproduced in full. By any objective standard, it was devastating journalism. The official Virginia response was swift, coordinated, and carefully calibrated to discredit without appearing to suppress. The Attorney General's office issued a statement noting that the materials cited had not been authenticated by any recognized archival authority and that the state had no record of any facility corresponding to the article's description. The Medical College of Virginia stated that a review of its records found no connection between the institution and any such project. The State Board of Health issued a similar statement. Several prominent Virginia historians were quoted in subsequent coverage expressing skepticism about the evidentiary basis. One professor from the College of William and Mary described the notebook reproductions as difficult to authenticate without access to the originals, and suggested that the interpretation placed on ambiguous historical material should be approached with caution. The story was picked up by 3 other Virginia newspapers, 2 of which ran their coverage alongside the skeptical historian commentary. It was not picked up by any national outlet. Within 6 weeks, it had effectively ceased to generate journalistic interest. In January of 1989, Demarest submitted the reporting for a Virginia Press Association award. The entry was acknowledged and then quietly withdrawn from consideration. He was never told why. He continued at the Roanoke Times for 12 more years. He never published a follow-up. When asked about it in later years, he said only that he had not been able to obtain the additional corroboration needed to take the story further. He died in 2001. His personal files, including all his Russell County research materials, were left to a nephew in North Carolina who donated them, without examination, to a regional history archive, where they sat in an uncatalogued collection for 14 years. By the end of 1988, the 3 principal investigators had been effectively dispersed. Carroll and Marsh was teaching high school in Scott County. Demarest had moved on. Dr. Holloway was still at the university. The department had not moved against her directly, which she understood as its own institutional message: you can stay as long as you stay quiet. But her Russell County research was boxed in her home office. The locked storage unit in Charlottesville held the tin box, the original notebooks, and 3 complete sets of photocopies. She paid the annual fee every year. She never told anyone where it was. The building above the Clinch River stood as a blackened shell through the late 1980s and into the 1990s. The kudzu came back in the spring of 1989, climbing the scorched stone walls with the same patient, indifferent persistence it had always shown. By the mid-1990s, the exterior was largely reclaimed by vegetation. By 2000, a person driving the logging road below would not have known the building was there. The logging road washed out in a flood in 1993 and was never repaired. The land remained registered to the same timber company, the company that had never conducted any operations in Russell County, until 2003, when it was transferred through a series of property transactions that would have required a determined title researcher several days to untangle to a private holding company based in Richmond. The holding company had 3 directors. 2 of them shared surnames with individuals named in the 1928 administrative correspondence. In Russell County, in the hollow communities below the ridge, the families who had been losing people since 1928 kept living their lives. They did not know about the notebooks. They did not know about the photographs or the newspaper series that had briefly flared and been extinguished. Many had never heard of Margaret Holloway or Robert Demarest or Carroll and Marsh. What they had were the same things they had always had. The gaps. The relatives who had not come home. The stories that grandmothers told in fragments, always stopping just short of the part that explained what had actually happened. The church records with the missing names. An absence sustained across generations. So familiar it had stopped feeling like a wound and become instead simply a feature of the landscape. As permanent, or so it seemed, as stone. Dr. Sarah Combs had spent her entire adult life in the shadow of a question she had not known, for most of that life, how to ask. She had grown up in Kingsport, Tennessee. The granddaughter of a woman who had come down out of the Virginia Hollow sometime in the early 1930s with nothing but the clothes on her back and a silence about her past so total, so completely without variation, that her family had eventually stopped trying to penetrate it. They had absorbed it the way families absorb all such silences, by building life around them, leaving them untouched, like a room in a house that nobody opens. Her grandmother, Ruth Combs, had lived to 84, sharp-minded to the end, fiercely loving, capable of great warmth and also of a particular stillness that settled over her at unpredictable moments, at dinner tables, during holiday gatherings, sometimes in the middle of an ordinary conversation. The family had learned to recognize it and not interrupt. It would pass. Ruth would return from wherever she had briefly gone and resume the conversation. And nobody asked where she had been. She died in 1991 without explaining the silence. But she left something, not deliberately, or perhaps deliberately, in the way that people who cannot speak directly sometimes leave traces for the people they love to find when they are ready. At the bottom of a cedar chest that Sarah cleared out after the funeral, beneath layers of folded quilts and wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that seemed incongruously deliberate among the other contents, was a folded sheet of paper, yellow and fragile, on which was written, in her grandmother's careful handwriting, a single line. I was at the place on the hill above the Clinch, Virginia, 1930. I came home. Not all of us did. Sarah had been 21 when she found that note. She had held it in her hands for a long time. She had understood, in the way that young people sometimes understand large things before they have the framework to articulate them, that this was the explanation for the room that nobody opened. That this was why her grandmother went somewhere else sometimes in the middle of conversations and came back with her face rearranged. She had also understood, with the practical clarity of a 21-year-old with no resources and no particular knowledge of how to investigate historical atrocities, that she had no idea what to do with it. So she had done the only thing she knew how to do. She had gone to college, then graduate school. She studied Appalachian history because it was the landscape she came from, the landscape where the silence in her grandmother's cedar chest was located. She published work on coal company practices in the early 20th century, on the public health infrastructure of the Appalachian coalfields, on the intersection of industrial labor systems and state eugenics programs. She built, without fully recognizing what she was building, the exact scholarly foundation she would need to understand what her grandmother's note was pointing to. And then, in 2001, she read a footnote. It appeared in a 1991 paper on the Virginia eugenics program published in the Journal of Southern History. A parenthetical reference in a sentence about the expansion of eugenics activities in rural Virginia during the late 1920s, noting that at least one informal research facility operating outside normal institutional oversight was reportedly established in the southwestern coalfield region during this period, though available documentation remains insufficient for definitive characterization. She tracked down the Demarest series through a regional newspaper archive. She read all 4 parts in a single sitting in her office in eastern Tennessee, with the door closed and the lights on against the afternoon dark. When she finished, she sat for a long time without moving. Then she wrote a letter to the University of Virginia's Geology Department. The letter sat unanswered for 2 years. In 2003, her phone rang. "I've been waiting," Dr. Holloway said without preamble, "for someone from one of those families to call me." "My grandmother's name was Ruth Combs," Sarah said. "She was from Haysai." A long silence on the line. Not an empty silence, but a full one. The silence of a person processing the particular weight of a 60-year circle closing. "She's in the notebooks," Dr. Holloway said quietly. "I found her name on the wall." The collaboration that began with that phone call would occupy the next 4 years of both women's professional lives. It would culminate in 2007 in the publication of Names in the Stone, the Clinch River Facility and the Hidden History of Appalachian Eugenics, recipient of the Lillian Smith Book Award for Nonfiction, cited in the Virginia governor's formal acknowledgement of the state's eugenics history in 2009, listed by the Washington Post as one of the 10 most important works of American historical scholarship of that decade. But the book was the end of the story. The clean version. Organized, contextualized, made legible. The 4 years that preceded it were none of those things. The first thing they did was contact Carol Ann Marsh. Carol Ann was 53 years old in 2003. She had been teaching high school history in Gate City for 15 years. She had kept her photocopied set of the notebooks in a fireproof lockbox under her bed, because she could not bring herself to destroy them and because she had never entirely stopped believing that someday she would find someone she could give them to. She met Holloway and Combs in a diner in Kingsport in October. She set the lockbox on the table between the coffee cups and looked at both women for a long moment. The particular evaluating look of someone who has learned through direct and painful experience to distinguish between people who mean what they say and people who only think they do. "Tell me you're not going to let this get buried again," she said. "We're not," Sarah said. Carol Ann studied her face. Then she pushed the lockbox across the table. "Take it," she said. "And do something with it that I couldn't." The second thing they did was go to the families. This was Sarah's contribution, the piece of the investigation that neither Holloway nor Demarest had been positioned to undertake in 1988. Sarah was a descendant of the Hollow communities. She spoke the dialect. She understood the particular layered privacy of Appalachian families, the way they protected their history not out of indifference but out of a hard-won understanding that sharing it with outsiders had historically produced nothing but more harm. She knew how to sit in someone's kitchen for 2 hours talking about weather and family and the price of everything before she asked the question she had actually come to ask. She spent 18 months through 2003 and 2004 interviewing elderly residents of Russell, Tazewell, Dickinson, and Buchanan counties. 74 people. Of those 74, 41 had direct or second-hand knowledge of the building above the Clinch River. Knowledge passed down through families in the same fragmented form that Thomas Beckett's grandmother had transmitted: "Don't go past the third ridge. Don't go near the Clinch in winter. Don't go looking for the building on the hill." 23 of those 41 had specific family members, a parent, a grandparent, an aunt or uncle, a sibling, who had been taken to the building and had not come back. Or had come back changed. Or had come back briefly and then disappeared again in ways the family had never understood. Of those 23 families, 17 had members whose names appeared in the notebooks. The meetings with those families were the hardest part of those 4 years. What Sarah was bringing to them was not the clean, resolved truth of a story with a clear ending, but the incomplete truth of a story whose ending remained, for many of them, unknown. She could tell them that their relative had been in the building. She could often tell them what had been done to them. She could not always tell them what had ultimately happened, because for many subjects in the notebooks, the record simply ended. A date of admission, a series of procedure entries, and then silence. For some families, this partial knowledge was harder than no knowledge at all. For others, it was something else. A recognition. A confirmation of what they had always sensed was there in the silence, now given form and language and a specific location: a building above the Clinch River, a room on the first floor, a name scratched into a wall with a fingernail. One woman, the granddaughter of a man whose name appeared as Subject 34, sat across from Sarah in her kitchen in Castlewood, listened until Sarah finished, and was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "My daddy used to wake up screaming." She looked at her hands. "He never told us why. We never asked. But I always thought he knew something. Something he couldn't carry alone and couldn't put down either." She looked up. "Does it matter now that we know?" Sarah thought about her grandmother and the piece of paper in the oilcloth and the room that nobody had opened for 60 years. "I think it mattered to your grandfather," she said, "that his name was written down somewhere. That someone would eventually come looking." The woman nodded slowly. She was crying, though her face remained still in the particular, controlled way of people who have learned to cry without making it visible. "Then yes," she said quietly, it matters. Dr. Holloway, meanwhile, worked the institutional angle, tracing document trails through the bureaucratic sediment of 7 decades. What she found expanded the picture in ways that confirmed what Demarest had suspected in 1988 and added dimensions he had not had access to. The Clinch River facility had operated from November 1928 to January 1932. Its closure had been precipitated not by any external discovery or official intervention but by the Great Depression. Funding dried up. The coal companies were in crisis. Harlow had made the practical decision to shut the operation down before the economic chaos of the Depression brought everyone's finances under closer scrutiny than usual. He lived until 1961. He retired from the Medical College of Virginia in 1949 with emeritus status and spent his final years in a comfortable house in Richmond's Fan District, cultivating roses and attending church on Sundays. His obituary in the Richmond Times-Dispatch described him as a distinguished physician and educator whose contributions to Virginia's medical heritage will long be remembered. It did not mention Russell County. Dr. Clarence Wolfe, the coal company medical officer who had arranged the referrals, retired in 1951 and died in 1964 in Bluefield. His son became chief medical officer at a major Roanoke hospital and served on the board of the Virginia Medical Society. Thomas Aldrich, the delegate who had provided access to the county nurse network, served in the House of Delegates until 1939, then returned to private business. He died in 1957 and was buried in a churchyard in Castlewood with a granite headstone that noted his years of public service to Russell County. Dr. Arthur Pemberton Voss, the Johns Hopkins professor who had written The Material is Excellent. Proceed as discussed, retired in 1950, received an honorary degree from his university in 1956, and died in Baltimore in 1962. A professorship in public health was endowed in his name. It remains active. None of them had ever been investigated. None of them had ever been charged with anything. None of them had ever publicly acknowledged the existence of the building above the Clinch River or the 231 people documented in its records. They had simply waited. And the silence had held, until now. Names in the Stone was published by the University of North Carolina Press in March of 2007. The book documented the Clinch River facility in full, the construction, the funding, the 3 experimental groups, the subjects' marginal notations, the dispersal of evidence in 1932, and the suppression of the 1987 to 1988 investigation. It named Harlow, Voss, Wolfe, and Aldrich by name. It reproduced, with the permission of their families, the names of 61 of the 231 documented subjects whose identities could be confirmed through public records. The Virginia Governor's Office responded in 2009 with a formal acknowledgement of the state's eugenics history, the first such acknowledgement to specifically reference the Clinch River facility by name. The statement expressed regret, offered no reparations, and did not address the question of the 2 other sites referenced in Harlow's correspondence. The sites in Dickinson and Buchanan counties that Demarest had been unable to locate in 1988, and that neither Holloway nor Combs had found in the subsequent years. Those sites remain unlocated. In the summer of 2007, shortly after the book's publication, a documentary filmmaker drove to the ridge above the Clinch River with a camera crew. The logging road was gone, washed out 14 years earlier and reclaimed by forest. They hiked in from the county road, following directions from the book's appendix. They found the building. The kudzu had covered the stone walls almost entirely. The interior was open sky, the floors collapsed, the debris of 60 years undisturbed by the fire that had burned through in 1988. The walls themselves, the stone walls where 47 people had scratched their names, were standing, thick with moss and vine, fire-blackened beneath the green. The names were gone. The fire had ensured that. But in the third room on the eastern side of what had once been the ground floor, where the plaster had been protected from the worst of the fire by the partially intact ceiling above, the filmmaker found something the 1988 fire had missed. A section of wall, roughly 3 feet wide, where the plaster had not fully burned, had charred and blackened, but not crumbled. And in the beam of the camera light, barely visible beneath the char, 2 words. Still there. Still legible, if you knew to look. Please remember. The filmmaker stood in front of that wall for a long time. Then he turned the camera off, because some things are not footage. Some things belong to the people who wrote them, and the people who finally came to read them, and to nobody else. In Scott County, Virginia, Carol Ann Marsh retired from teaching in 2011 after 30 years in the same high school. At her retirement party, her students gave her a framed reproduction of one of the notebook pages, the page with Eliza Rowe's marginal notation, "If you find this, please tell them I was here," that Sarah Combs had sent as a gift. Carol Ann hung it in her living room, where it remains. In Kingsport, Tennessee, Sarah Combs still teaches. She still has her grandmother's note, the piece of paper in the oilcloth, the single line that started everything. She had it framed after the book was published and set it on her desk where she can see it while she works. I was at the place on the hill above the Clinch, Virginia, 1930. I came home. Not all of us did. Ruth Combs had come home. The notebooks confirmed it. Subject 38, female, age 26, Group A, observational status. Admission date October 1930. Discharge notation March 1931. No experimental procedures. She had been monitored, kept, and eventually released for reasons the records did not explain. Perhaps her condition had deteriorated in ways that made her no longer useful to the study. Perhaps the facility had become overcrowded. Perhaps, in the particular randomness of evil conducted at scale, she had simply been lucky. She had come home. And she had kept the silence of someone who understood, with the clarity of a person who has seen what institutions do to people who speak, that speaking was not an option available to her. She had kept it for 60 years. And then she had folded one sentence into a piece of oilcloth at the bottom of a cedar chest, and she had waited for the right person to open it. In Russell County, in the hollows below the ridge, the families who had been missing pieces of themselves since 1928 received, in the years after the book's publication, the only thing that was still possible to give them, a name for the gap, a location, a documentation. The knowledge, small and incomplete and 60 years too late, but real, that what had happened had happened. Had been witnessed. Had been recorded. And had finally been said aloud. Not by the state. Not by the institutions that had built the building and funded it and burned it and buried the records and waited out the investigators. By a geologist who had been looking for a fault line. By a graduate student who had grown up in the hollows and recognized the names on the walls. By a journalist who had refused to go home. By a teacher who had kept a lockbox under her bed for 15 years. And by a granddaughter who had found a piece of paper in a cedar chest and had spent 20 years building herself into the person who could understand what it said. The building above the Clinch River still stands. Or what remains of it stands. The stone shell, the fire-blackened walls, the empty windows open to the Appalachian sky. The kudzu covers it in summer so completely that from a distance, on the ridge above the river, it looks like a low hill, an ordinary feature of the terrain, nothing that would make a person stop. Up close, if you push through the vine and step through what was once the iron doorway, you can still see the shape of the corridor. The rooms on either side. The staircase at the far end, collapsed now to the ground, but its outline still visible in the stone. The plaster walls are mostly gone, fire and weather and 60 years of mountain winters have taken them, but the stone walls remain. And stone, as the mountains have always known, does not forget. Somewhere in those walls, in the deep interior of the fieldstone that the plaster had covered, in the faces of the rock that no fire and no kudzu and no institutional silence has yet reached, the marks remain. Not legible. Not recoverable. But present. Embedded in the material of the place, the way all things are embedded in the places where they happen, impossible to fully erase as long as the stone stands. 231 names. 47 of them scratched into the walls with fingernails by people who understood that the only power left to them was the power of insisting, in whatever material was available, that they had existed. That they had been here. That whatever had been done to them and whatever happened next, they would not disappear without a trace. William Cates, Dante, Virginia. Ruth Combs, Hasey, Virginia. John Fletcher, age 14, Clinch. Eliza Rowe, 2 daughters, May and Clara. Samuel Pruitt, age 31, not sick, not sick. They were wrong about one thing and right about everything else. They were wrong that the trace could be preserved. The walls burned, the plaster crumbled, the physical evidence erased by the people whose names were on the orders. But they were right that someone would come looking. And they were right that it would matter. And they were right, in the most profound and terrible and ultimately unconquerable way, that they had existed. That they had names. That the mountain held their memory the way it holds everything. Permanently, absolutely, and without any intention of letting go. The mountains don't forget. They never did. In the autumn of every year, when the leaves turn and the Clinch River runs cold and the pines on the ridge above Castlewood move in the long low wind that comes down from the higher peaks, the building sits in its silence. Nobody goes there. Nobody needs to. The names have already been spoken. They will not be unspoken.